Okay. So before we start, could you just give a brief introduction of yourself?
Yes. So my name is Kyle Werner. I'm a composer based in New York City. I teach at Manhattan School of Music pre-college, and I'm the director of the conservatory at the Geneva School of Manhattan. So I'm a composer, music educator, administrator, a little bit of everything. I'm originally from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then studied in Cincinnati and at Manhattan School of Music myself for college and grad school. And as a composer, I do a lot of work in the world of orchestral music, chamber music, ballet, all sorts of different kind of genres within classical music.
Could you share any initial inspirations for your pieces and how you go about the process in composing a piece?
Yeah, so it kind of some of it depends on the piece. There are some pieces where I just sort of come up with the idea on my own. So in terms of things like that, I get a lot of inspiration from birdsong or travel or nature or literature. Kind of it depends on what kind of project I'm working on. Other times it will be a piece that has text, like a vocal piece, something where my starting point is the words. Other times it will be a collaboration with somebody like a choreographer who has ideas about a piece, or sometimes it's a commissioner who wants to commission a certain type of piece of music and they have an idea or a concept that they want to do. Um, so regardless of who comes up with the idea, the starting point is kind of chewing on the idea, thinking through how would that idea translate into music. Once I start to get some ideas about that, my first step is to actually write notes in a little journal. So I like to have a little music paper journal that I bring with me on walks to the park or to the Met Museum or things like that. When I start a piece, I like to start with just thinking through the ideas for the concept and then just humming musical ideas. I like to start with the voice before I even go to the piano. So I will write lots of kind of small ideas for the melodies or chords or rhythms in there, and then I'll also kind of journal and figure out where do I feel like the piece is going? How am I going to embody the whatever concepts are driving the piece? How am I planning out the form? I usually like to have a pretty strong idea about what the form and the shape of the outline of the piece will be before I start because I feel like that helps me keep from getting lost too much. I mean, that plan might change along the way, but that's usually how I start. Once I've got a lot of ideas, then I will go to the piano and to start working out the ideas a bit more. At that point, I like to switch from the small journal to really big music paper, things where I can write down a lot of music and see a lot of music on the same page. That helps me kind of get perspective and see how the sections are shaping up. That's where I will also take the melodic ideas that I was kind of humming and writing down before and copy them out, change them, and then start to add a bass line, start to add harmonies or textures, things that I can't completely hear in my head and that I kind of need the piano and my fingers to figure out. Um, so I usually write a complete draft of the piece that way. I'm pretty old school. I like to have a paper draft at least as a structure. Usually that draft is a kind of a reduced form. So for instance, if I'm writing for um, multiple instruments, I might boil them down to just a few staves, something that can be played more or less on the piano. Even if I'm writing for a whole orchestra, most of my sketches will be kind of melody baseline accompaniment, just thinking of the main outline of what the notes are doing. And then I'll write some indications of what the instruments are going to be doing within that. So once I've got a good draft of that, then I will take it over to the computer and start typing it in to Sibelius, which is the notation program I use. And so as I type it in, sometimes I'm editing, sometimes I'm changing notes. And then I'm also kind of expanding. So if I wrote something in a shorthand, then I will kind of blow it up and write out all the instrumental parts, all the detailed indications about things. Um, And then that also allows me to make a nice score in parts that somebody can actually read, so they don't have to read my handwriting. So then I will generate the PDF or the MIDI if needed, and then get that over to the performers.
Are there like any specific like musical ideas or themes that you've like explored in your pieces?
Yeah, I think a lot of my pieces have to do with kind of the natural world, different natural environments. There was a piece I wrote a couple of years ago. A cellist friend named Nathan Vickery from the New York Philharmonic, and a pianist friend, Eileen Buck, who teaches at Manus Prep. They play together as a duo often and had mentioned the idea of me writing a piece. So I was thinking of different ideas, and I was thinking about all these beautiful places I've been to in northern Michigan and Wisconsin and or Ontario, the boreal forests, which is a really unique natural environment kind of across the northern part of the country and even around other parts of the world. A lot of beautiful, both the forests and the lakes, but also the birds, the different bird songs. I'm someone that's really into listening to bird song, and so I actually um, used all of those inspirations in this piece called Sonata Borealis, which is for cello and piano. And so, yeah, the different movements you kind of hear different musical textures and melodies based on some of these different environments. And then there are even quotations from specific bird songs like thrushes or warblers that I've heard up there. Another example is a chamber orchestra piece I recently written. The commissioner had the idea of a piece called Storm at Sea and Sunrise. And he's someone who his family has a lot of kind of sailors in their past. And so he had the idea of something kind of a nautical piece. And so in that case, the form and the concept came from the commissioner, but they were very much in line with things that I like to do. I've written a lot of pieces about lakes and oceans and rivers and things. And so that piece was interesting because the challenge was to create two different musical arcs. There was this kind of very fast building, tumultuous arc of the storm building and blowing up and subsiding, and then this kind of slower, gentler, more gradual arc of the sunrise coming out of that. So with that one, I had to spend a lot of time figuring out the timing and proportions to make it feel right. And then I was also intrigued to try to find a way to find musical ideas that would be connected, because I was thinking about the fact that it's kind of the same, it's the same water and the same wind that creates both the storm and the kind of peaceful atmosphere afterwards. So I wanted to figure out ways that the musical ideas could be transformed, that this sort of the same water could then take a different form in the calmer version after that. So yeah, those are a couple of examples. I think sometimes I'll do pieces that are more abstract. Often when I work with a ballet choreographer named Silas Farley, who is a former dancer with the New York City Ballet. So he comes from the choreographic tradition of George Balanchine, doing a lot of pieces to more abstract pieces of classical music. So sometimes we'll create pieces that are there's less of a kind of plot or a concept behind it, but it's more that I create the music and use kind of different variations on classical forms, and then the dance will sort of fill in within that. And so right now I'm writing a piano quintet, a piece for piano and string quartet for the National Ballet School of Canada up in Toronto. So I'm writing the music, and then Silas will come in and do the choreography. So that's an example of a piece where it's more about kind of classical musical forms and choreographic forms without having a more specific concept attached to it. So those are a couple of examples.
Next question is, how do you approach creating compositions that resonate among like a very diverse population of audiences while also staying true to your musical identity?
Yeah, no, that's a big question. What I have noticed, back when I first went to college to University of Cincinnati, I went there because I loved classical music. I'd grown up playing piano and classical guitar, and then I played percussion in youth orchestra. So I was introduced to a lot of different facets of the classical repertoire through those different musical activities. I'd also fallen in love with some like choral music and things like that. So I went to college for composition because I was a real classical music nerd. And what I found when I went to college is that whether I was sitting in theory class or sitting around at the lunch table or in ensemble rehearsals, is that there are all these friends around me from all different parts of the country, all different parts of the world, all different backgrounds, people that are very different as people, but share the same love of classical music. We were all fellow classical music nerds. And that it was actually neat to see the way that the music could bring us together across all of our different other differences. And so um, that's where I've kind of realized because classical music already has a diverse global audience that just connecting within that art form itself, I find that that happens kind of naturally when you write the music that you love. I feel that sort of no matter what, no matter who you put your music in front of, there are going to be some people who like it and some people don't. And so, what I've learned is that if you write music that is coming from a sincere place, it tends to kind of connect with audiences naturally. The audiences again, it often depends on what the audiences are already into. But I find that because I'm sort of writing within the classical tradition, new music that is specifically using the forms of the classical tradition that it ends up appealing to whoever loves that kind of music, regardless of where they might have come from.
What do you think are the biggest challenges faced by contemporary composers and performers within the classical music industry today?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest challenges are actually there. I'm noticing they're kind of the same challenges they've always been. That even though today it's the modern world, there's all this technology, there's all this, all of the drama of today. When I read music history, I notice that it's the challenge is always getting started, no matter who you are and where you are, is getting good training, figuring out how to get your music in front of people, figuring out how to make the money work. Sometimes that means figuring out how to either to make money through your music or to make money in other ways that free you up with enough time to also do your music. And some of it is just being patient that if you keep at it and keep getting your music in front of people and keep making new connections, it will grow over time. But again, I would say the biggest challenge is the kind of the process of getting started and of getting through the initial trials that come from the time right after school.
So, the main objective of Classical is to spread contemporary music. So, how do you think contemporary classical music can be made more accessible to a wider audience?
Yeah, I think, well, so what I would say is thankfully nowadays there's so many different composers writing so many different kinds of music and well, so I think that there were earlier times where maybe contemporary music largely sounded a certain way, which maybe people would either kind of take it or leave it. Um, I think that because there is such a variety, I think that the main goal should be to curate the concerts and the programs or the recordings in a way that shows off that variety so that everyone can find something they like. There's a lot of contemporary music that I like and a lot of contemporary music that I don't like, but those lines might be different for someone else. So what I like to do is kind of listen broadly um, across a lot of different composers, and then you sort of find something you like within that. Personally, I have found over the years, in school, I sort of experimented with a lot of different things in my musical language, but especially since finishing grad school, I've been focusing on music that is more melodically driven, that uses a lot of these kind of forms that come from classical music, but doing them in different ways. And I have found that if you write music from the heart and from the soul and you keep the melody first, you make sure that there is some kind of a singable line that can really that people can hear and relate to. That tends to connect with people pretty well. That doesn't mean there isn't room for other kinds of music driven by other things, but I personally have found that often both audiences and performers of classical music I've talked to have found that in a lot of contemporary music, they're missing some of the melodic directness or some of the tonal harmony that they find in the music from the standard repertoire. So that's where I realized, even though there's a lot of different ways to go with contemporary music, that I actually like to write new music for the audiences of classical music. And so what I've found is through that, I'm able to reach people that a lot of other contemporary music isn't reaching. So that's one way it's worked for me.
How would you recommend people who play instruments to understand modern classical music and approach like playing it?
Hmm. Yeah, I think one of the challenges with that is, as I mentioned, because there's so many different kinds of music going on, it means that it's going to look a little different with each piece. If you're learning the music of Bach, you kind of learn about what Bach does, and once you study a few pieces, you can kind of use that as a way of understanding where the other ones are coming from. Um, I would think, do you mean by that somebody who's a performer who's trying to study the music?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say if you're trying to perform a new piece, I would start by learning who the composer's influences are, seeing kind of what makes them tick, where they're coming from, where their inspirations are. And then my main thing is just kind of looking for patterns. So when I teach my music theory classes, I always say that in one word, the way I would describe music theory is patterns, that we're just trying to look at how is the music put together. So in terms of making the music easier to learn, I'm always looking for whatever patterns there are that are organizing the music. But that helps with the technical side, I would say, so that you figure out what the notes are doing and how they're put together. But again, looking at who the composer's influences are, what their inspirations are, what their values are, I think that that gives you a clue into what they're trying to say. And so that will give you more ideas about how to express the music, how to interpret the music beyond the notes. If the composer is a living composer, then you could either, talk to them, or if you can't get a hold of them, see if there's interviews with them. Um, I always think it's so interesting to see what do people love, what do people hate, what bugs people. Usually composers are pretty opinionated people in some way or another. So yeah, see what the composer cares about and how that translates into the way that they create their music. And I think that will open a lot of doors for you as a performer. But again, that is going to look different depending on the composer because composers are writing so many different kinds of music these days.
Do you have any composers that you're inspired by when you're writing your compositions?
Hmm. So I think what really got me into being a composer most of all is music from the late 19th century through the early 20th century. So anywhere from kind of Mahler, Sibelius, Bruckner, Debussy, Ravel, Stravinsky, Holst. A lot of the composers of that era I really enjoy because it's a time when they were the training for classical music and classical composition. It was a point where the training was very strong because they were learning about many centuries of music. They were learning about everything from the Renaissance to the Baroque to the classical era. So they had a really wide vocabulary of melodic structures and counterpoint and harmony and sonata forms. They had a lot of different tools in their toolbox. And yet it was also a time where there was a lot of variety. People were learning more about more different kinds of music. Debussy at some of these universal expositions in Paris was getting to hear music from all different parts of the world that he had never heard before. So I think that that music, there is the music of those times, there's an interesting mixture of composers that had a lot of craft and a lot of tools in their toolbox, but also a really wide range of expression and influence. The 20th century, a lot of crazy things happened. I think that there were some things that got lost in the mix with that. But I think that there's also a through line of composers since then who have sort of continued in that vein, more or less.
Are there any unexplored areas within music composition that you're particularly excited to delve into with your new projects?
Hmm. Well, I think some things that I haven't gotten to explore yet. I would like to write. I wrote some vocal music for a bit in grad school. I'd like to do more things with vocal music. I'd like to do some things with more art songs and opera. Although I've done a fair amount of work in ballet, it's been more kind of abstract ballets. So at some point, I would love to write some story ballets, things that are based on kind of mythology or fairy tales, like some of the great classical ballets are. Yeah, I think that would be a lot of fun. I wrote my first symphony last year, which that actually was part of a ballet project as well down at the Houston Ballet, and um, it was a ton of work, but then after finishing it made me think, gosh, I would like to write another symphony sometime.
What advice would you give students who want to start composing?
I would say the first thing would be to just listen to a lot of different kinds of music and just kind of as many things as you can get your hands on. And when you find something you like, kind of go down the rabbit hole, meaning listen, if you find it. So what happened for me was when I was taking piano lessons growing up, one time my teacher played the piece Clair de Lune by Debussy, very famous piano piece. And that was the first piece of Debussy that I had heard. And so then I started to go to the library and just check out, and this is in the era of CDs. This is showing how old I am. I would just check out CDs of more of Debussy's music. So that was how I learned about his string quartet and his other chamber music and his orchestral music and his, vocal music. And then I started to learn, all right, who was Debussy influenced by? And then who were people that came after him? So like really every piece of music that you love can become almost like the trunk of a tree, and then you find the branches out of there, the other pieces by the same composer, and then pieces by other composers before or after. And so I would say when you find music you love, don't be afraid to just steal ideas from it and imitate it. I think that sometimes young composers today are under too much pressure to be original right away. But I think that creating something truly new in music really does take time, and it's usually the result of, nothing comes from nowhere. We're all human beings. We don't live on a desert island. And so something that feels new and fresh comes from somebody who has listened to a lot of different music and mastered their craft and really digested their influences to the point where it doesn't feel like they're just copying someone. It's just they naturally their influences come out in their music, and they find the newness in their music comes from unique combinations. So that's where I would say I would don't be afraid to just steal ideas from the composers you like. Find a good teacher, somebody that can guide you along the way. Study music theory. That was actually, in terms of putting music together, it was taking music theory for the first time that really helped me get started because I learned things about how the music is put together. Um, yeah, studying melodic writing, harmony, and counterpoint, all of those basics of how composers have put together music over the centuries. What I found freeing about studying all of that is that you start by just kind of following the rules and not worrying about being original, and that often it is actually kind of almost like doing a puzzle more than anything else. So you learn how the moving parts fit together. How does a melodic structure work? How does two-part counterpoint work in the different species or in the different rhythms? How does harmony work in four voices? There's a lot of, different books and, ways of learning these things, different websites online now. But what I found is through learning all of those kind of traditional forms of musical craft, that meant that, to come back to the analogy before, it meant that I have more tools in my toolbox. When I first started writing in high school, I just would start with a blank piece of staff paper and just start putting notes down, and I would get lost pretty fast. Whereas now, when I start a piece, I have as references the forms of the different pieces of music I studied, different approaches to writing melody and harmony and counterpoint. So it means that I don't really feel like I'm starting from a blank page anymore, that there's always other composers in my memory who are kind of helping me along to get my ideas started. So that's where I would say as a young composer, you need all the help you can get. So don't be afraid to just take in a lot of influences, study with different teachers, and I would also say find whatever opportunities you can to get your music played by good musicians and to get good live performances, to get good recordings. Um, See how your music works in front of an audience, and see what audience members have to say about it. That's always really interesting. Um, Sometimes that's to come back to your question from earlier, that's another thing that can be a challenge about getting started is getting good recordings of your music so that you can submit those when you're trying to get your music out to people. But once you get a few of them, then it's helpful because those will then generate the next opportunities.
The last question is, do you have any contemporary composers who you think are underrepresented or should be remembered?
Hmm. Yeah, it's sort of boy, there's so many examples today. It's hard to pick just one. I think one composer I was thinking of, this is somebody who is not contemporary to today, but somebody who I think is worth remembering, maybe isn't as well known as a classical guitarist. I studied the music of a composer named Agustin Barrios, who is from the Guarani tribe down in Paraguay. And I was recently learning more about him. There was a program about him on the PBS program Now Hear This. And I thought he was a really neat example of a composer who brought the elements of the folk music from his culture into the classical music tradition. He studied the music of Bach and Schumann and all these other people. And he was a brilliant guitarist. And he's somebody that I think he's well known in the classical guitar world that I came from. But what I've noticed is that a lot of other people don't really know his music. So I think that although he's not a living composer, he's someone that comes to mind to me as somebody who deserves to be recognized sort of outside of the world that he's known in. So that would be one example I could think of.
Okay, thank you so much for doing this interview with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I saw you had a question about using the script of it or the podcast or whatever. That's fine.
Okay.
You're welcome to.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah. Any other questions come up?
No, that's it.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Olivia, and excited to hear about what you're doing and keep up the good work.
Okay, thank you.
All right.